They scorned the silent bride, mistaking her quiet for emptiness, until a rancher's little girl took her hand and whispered the truth only a child could see. Could this voiceless woman be the answer to a lonely father's prayers and a family's healing? The morning sun stretched across the Wyoming plains, spilling gold over the Boone Ranch. The air was crisp, still carrying the bite of spring. Luke Boone, rancher, widower, and father to a lively 7-year-old girl, rode back from the early roundup with dust on his boots and weariness in his eyes. He was used to silence these days. It had been his companion since his wife's passing, and though his daughter Daisy filled the house with chatter, laughter, and endless curiosity, the nights stretched long and quiet. But that morning, silence met him in a different way. The stagecoach had brought her, a woman in a modest gray dress, bonnet pulled low, and eyes downcast. Folks in town whispered before she even stepped down. They'd expected a bride for Luke Boone. He hadn't denied the advertisements he'd placed, but no one expected this. A woman who could not speak. "She's mute," someone muttered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "What kind of wife can't even say vows?" Laughter rolled through the gathered men outside the mercantile. The women shook their heads. A rancher needed a strong, hearty wife, one who could talk, sing, pray, scold, and soothe. This woman, this Clara, seemed to offer none of those things. Luke dismounted slowly, ignoring the whispers. He'd seen her letters, simple but earnest, written with the hand of someone who had learned patience. She hadn't lied, she'd said, her voice was gone. He had admired her honesty when others tried to sell themselves with pretty words. Clara lifted her eyes once, just enough for Luke to catch the color clear as the Wyoming sky. She didn't flinch at the laughter. She didn't shrink. She simply placed her hands over her folded bag, waiting. "Boone," a ranch hand chuckled from the side. "Looks like you ordered yourself a ghost." Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was answer enough. He offered Clara his hand. She placed hers gently in his, and together they turned from the crowd, walking toward the wagon where Daisy waited. Daisy leaned over the side, braids bouncing, her freckles brighter than the Sunday. "Papa, is she the one?" Clara stopped short, uncertainty flickering across her face. But Daisy grinned wide, studying her with the seriousness only a child could muster. Then she said softly, "She doesn't need words. I can hear her already. She speaks to my heart." The hush that fell over the street was sharper than the earlier laughter. Luke lifted Clara onto the wagon seat beside Daisy, then climbed up himself. He didn't bother to explain, didn't need to. The girl's words had done more than any argument could. As the wagon rattled toward Boone Ranch, Luke stole a glance at Clara. Her hands clutched the bag tightly, her lips pressed together, but her eyes held a spark. And for the first time in a long while, Luke felt the stir of something beyond silence, something that might grow if given room. If you've ever seen a whole town silenced by a child's truth, wait until you see what happens when Clara steps into the Boone Ranch. The Boone Ranch stretched wide under the Wyoming sky, a patchwork of fields, barns, and weathered fences. Clara sat stiffly on the wagon seat as it rattled into the yard, her hands folded tight in her lap. The house ahead was modest but sturdy, its porch worn by years of boots and Sunday. It was not the grand home some brides might have dreamed of, but there was a warmth about it that drew her gaze. Daisy hopped down before the wagon stopped, skirts flying, her laughter echoing against the barn walls. She ran to the corral, where the horses lifted their heads at her call. Clara watched her, something easing inside her chest. The girl's energy filled the air like music she could not make herself. Luke lifted Clara's bag from the wagon and set it by the porch. He did not speak, only held the door open for her. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and saddle leather. The furniture was plain but cared for, a quilt folded neatly over the back of the couch, a Bible resting open on the table. Clara traced her fingers along the edge of the quilt, feeling the stitches. Each square had been made with careful hands. She wondered if it had been Luke's late wife. The thought made her throat tighten, though no sound came. Daisy bounded back in, cheeks flushed. "You can sleep in Mama's room," she said matter-of-factly, though Luke's sharp glance reminded her of her boldness. Clara lowered her eyes, but Daisy slipped her hand into hers. "Don't worry, Papa keeps it real nice. He says we're waiting for someone who belongs here." The words struck deeper than Daisy knew. Clara squeezed the small hand gently, her silent way of answering. Later, as Luke showed her the room at the end of the hall, Clara noticed how carefully it was kept. The lace curtains were washed, the bed made, a vase of dried flowers on the windowsill. Dust had not claimed it, though clearly no one had slept there in years. She placed her bag by the dresser, then turned to find Luke watching her with guarded eyes. She gave a small nod of gratitude. He dipped his head once in acknowledgement before leaving her to settle. That evening, supper was eaten mostly in silence. Daisy talked enough for all three of them, filling the air with questions Clara could not answer aloud. Instead, Clara smiled, shook her head, or tapped the table once for yes, twice for no. Daisy caught on quickly, delighting in the game. Luke watched, his expression unreadable, though now and then his gaze lingered on Clara, as if measuring the weight of her presence. When the dishes were cleared, Clara stepped outside. The sky blazed with stars, brighter than she had ever seen. For the first time in years, she let herself hum a low, trembling sound that rose unbidden from her chest. It was fragile, but it was hers. Behind her, from the shadows of the porch, Luke paused, his heart clenched at the sound. It had been so long since music had touched this house. Morning at Boone Ranch began with the cry of roosters and the creak of old wood. Clara rose early, her hands folded in the cool water of the basin as she washed. She pinned her hair back neatly, smoothed her plain dress, and stepped into the kitchen where Daisy was already perched at the table, swinging her legs. "Papa says you don't gotta help anyone," Daisy chirped. "But I told him you'd want to." Clara smiled faintly, nodding. Work had always been her way of speaking when words failed. She gestured toward the stack of unwashed dishes by the sink. Daisy grinned, hopping down to hand her a rag. By the time Luke entered, boots heavy on the floorboards, the kitchen smelled of fresh cornbread, and the table gleamed clean. Clara had rolled up her sleeves, her cheeks flushed with effort. She glanced up just as he paused in the doorway. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Luke gave a curt nod before taking his seat. Daisy filled the silence with chatter. "Papa, Clara can do chores real good. She washed everything, even that old skillet you said was too stubborn." Luke's gaze flickered toward the shining iron pan. His brow eased slightly. He reached for the bread, breaking it in half, and set a piece carefully on Clara's plate. She lowered her eyes but felt warmth rush through her chest. After breakfast, Clara followed Daisy outside. The girl darted toward the chicken coop, dragging Clara by the hand. "You hum again," Daisy said suddenly, her tone insistent. "Last night I heard you. It was pretty. Like when the meadowlarks come in spring." Clara froze, startled. Few people had ever spoken of her voice with kindness. Slowly, she shook her head. She had only meant for the sound to slip out into the night, unnoticed. But Daisy's eager face left no room for retreat. With trembling lips, Clara let out a soft note. The chickens stirred, tilting their heads. Daisy clapped her hands in delight. "See, Papa," she called across the yard. "She sings." Luke, mending a fence post nearby, looked up. For a heartbeat, his hammer stilled midair. Clara's hum faded quickly, swallowed by embarrassment. She turned away, brushing straw from her skirt. The rest of the day was filled with chores. Clara gathered eggs, brushed down the horses, and swept the porch. Each task steadied her, giving her a place in the rhythm of the ranch. Luke said little, but his eyes followed her more than once. He seemed torn between caution and curiosity, like a man standing on the edge of water he wasn't sure he could cross. As dusk fell, Clara carried a pail of water to the barn. She paused when she heard soft hoofbeats and saw Luke's horse nudge his hand as he worked in the stall. His voice, low and careful, carried in the still air as he murmured to the animal. Clara stilled. She had not yet heard him speak to her, but in that moment, she knew his silence was not emptiness. It was grief, tightly bound. And for the first time, she wanted to answer it. The days at Boone Ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, one Clara found both strange and comforting. She had expected suspicion, maybe even rejection, but instead she was given space room to prove herself without pressure and kindness where she least expected it. Daisy tugged her into every corner of ranch life, and Luke, though distant, never once turned her away. Still, at night when the house grew still, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the past she'd left behind. A father's cold commands, a household that saw silence as weakness, and neighbors who mocked what they couldn't understand. She had fled not only loneliness but cruelty, and yet part of her feared it might find her again. That evening, after Daisy had fallen asleep by the fire with a doll clutched tight, Clara lingered in the parlor. A small wooden box sat on the mantel. Its surface was scarred, but polished with care. She reached out, brushing her fingers over it. The lid creaked open, revealing sheets of paper worn soft at the edges, music, handwritten in careful lines. Clara's heart caught. She recognized the notes from memory, though she had never seen them on paper. The lullaby she often hummed, the one that had followed her since childhood, was written there. A floorboard groaned behind her. She turned quickly, startled, and found Luke standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the open box. For the first time, she saw something unguarded in his face, a deep wound laid bare. Clara's hands shook as she pointed to the sheet, then pressed her palm over her heart. Her eyes asked the question she could not voice. How do I know this song? Luke stepped forward slowly, his rough hands curling into fists. My wife, he said, voice low and unused. The first word he had spoken directly to Clara. It sounded raw, like a blade scraped against stone. She wrote it. Clara's breath caught. She lowered her gaze, ashamed of what she did not understand. Why had she carried this melody? Why had it found her, when it belonged to another woman, Luke's wife? Luke shut the box with a quiet snap, then turned away, shoulders stiff. His silence closed in again, heavier than before. Clara stood rooted, torn between retreat and the desire to bridge the chasm his words had opened. But her courage faltered. She slipped back into her room, heart pounding with questions she could not ask. In the hallway, Luke remained still, one hand braced against the wall. Speaking to her, that single word had awakened. More than memory, it had loosened grief, he thought, long buried. He had not intended to let it slip, yet when her hum had echoed his wife's song, it had been too much to bear in silence. Outside, the wind stirred across the plains, carrying the faintest trace of Clara's voice from earlier that day. Luke closed his eyes, torn between the ache of remembrance and the fragile hope of something new. A storm rolled across the plains that night, lightning splitting the sky and thunder rattling the shutters. Clara sat upright in bed, her breath shallow. Storms had always frightened her, the crack of thunder, like fists pounding on locked doors. She pressed her palms over her ears, but the memories came anyway. Raised voices, a hand clamping her wrist, the demand to speak up when she could not. Another clap shook the house. She bit her lip hard, willing herself to stay quiet, to be still. But when a flash of lightning illuminated the room, her resolve crumbled. A strangled cry escaped her lips, not words, only raw fear. The door burst open. Luke stood there, hair damp from rain, his shirt half-buttoned as if he had come straight from the barn. His eyes swept the room until they found her curled against the headboard. For a long moment he only stared, his chest heaving. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to wave him away, ashamed of her weakness, but her body betrayed her, shaking with sobs that no silence could contain. Luke stepped inside. He didn't speak, Habit bound him still, but he crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed. His hand hovered in the air, uncertain, before finally resting lightly on her arm. She flinched, then stilled, sensing no force in his touch, only steadiness. Her sobs broke into gasps, and in that fragile moment, Luke's silence cracked. "It's okay." The words were rough, rusty, as though dragged out from the depths of a long-sealed well. But they were words. His voice. Clara's eyes widened. Luke looked as startled as she did, his hand falling back to his knee. He hadn't spoken in years, not since the night his wife died in a storm just like this one. But seeing Clara fold into herself, so small against the thunder, had torn something loose inside him. Clara blinked through tears, her lips parting in wonder. She touched her chest, then pointed gently at him, silently asking, "Did you say that?" His throat worked. He swallowed hard. "Yes." One word. But it filled the room like a hymn. Clara's tears slowed. She reached for his hand with trembling fingers, clasping it with quiet gratitude. Her silence met his broken voice, and somehow they made sense together. The thunder rolled again, softer now, as though the storm itself had lessened its hold. Clara leaned back, exhausted but calmer. Luke rose slowly, his face pale with the weight of what had just happened. At the door he paused and looked back. His voice caught, but he forced it out. "Clara." Her name hung in the air, tender and uncertain. Her eyes shone in reply, though no sound left her lips. For the first time since he'd buried his wife, Luke Boone closed a door, not to shut someone out, but to guard what fragile truth had just been born inside. Rain hammered the roof through the night, the storm refusing to move on. By morning, the pastures had turned to mud, and the river swelled against its banks. Luke rose early, checking fences, driving cattle to higher ground. Clara stayed inside with Daisy, keeping the fire steady while the wind pressed against the walls. When dusk fell, the storm struck harder. The house rattled, the windows groaned in their pains. Clara tried to keep her hands busy, sewing a tear in Daisy's dress, but her thread snapped twice from trembling fingers. Every boom of thunder sent her back to places she didn't want to remember. When Daisy finally fell asleep against the couch, Clara slipped to the barn. She couldn't stand the confinement of the house, not with the storm clawing at her nerves. She found comfort among the animals, their warm breaths, their steady presence. She sat in the straw, drawing her knees to her chest, but the next flash of lightning split the sky so fiercely she cried out before she could stop herself. Footsteps crunched in the doorway. Luke stood there, rain dripping from his hat brim. His gaze swept over her, softening when he saw the fear she couldn't hide. He stepped inside, closing the barn door behind him. "I know," he said quietly, voice rough but steady. "I know what it does to you." Clara blinked, startled by the words. He knelt a few feet away, not touching her, but near enough to be felt. His eyes, usually guarded, were bare with memory. "My wife." His jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed ready to retreat into silence again, but he pushed through it. "She died in a storm like this. Horse spooked, wagon overturned. I couldn't save her, couldn't even say goodbye." His breath shook, so I stopped saying anything at all. Clara's heart clenched. She wanted to tell him she understood that silence wasn't absence, but sometimes the only way to bear pain. Instead, she pressed her hand to her chest, then stretched it toward him, her way of saying she shared the weight. He looked at her hand, then slowly placed it over it, warm, calloused, steady. For the first time, silence didn't hang between them like a wall, it was a bridge. A long roll of thunder shook the barn. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them, her lips parted, and a sound slipped free, a fragile melody, a lullaby, trembling but true. She sang into the storm, not to defy it, but to soften its teeth. Luke's throat worked. The song was familiar, the same one that had carried through his home in another life. This time, though, it didn't break him. It steadied him. His lips moved, shaky at first, then firmer. He sang with her. His voice cracked, but it carried, joining hers in the darkened barn. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls, something shifted. The silence that had ruled Luke Boone's life began to give way not to noise, but to music, fragile and shared. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the Boone ranch washed clean, the fields glistening with morning dew. Clara stepped onto the porch with Daisy, the air smelling of wet earth and pine. For a rare moment, she felt lighter, like the music she and Luke had shared in the barn had cleared something from both their hearts. But peace never lingered long. By midday, the steady rhythm of hooves broke the quiet. A rider approached along the dirt road, tall in the saddle, his black hat pulled low. Clara froze, her stomach twisting. Even at a distance, the cut of his figure was too familiar. Luke came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His jaw tightened as the stranger drew closer. "Afternoon," the man called, tipping his hat when he reached the yard. His smile was practiced, too smooth. "Name's Reverend Hale. I'm looking for someone, a young woman." Clara's heart thudded. She stepped back, but Daisy caught her hand, sensing the sudden tension. Luke said nothing, his silence sharp as steel. Hale dismounted, brushing dust from his coat. "She ran off not long ago. Fragile little thing. Don't belong out here alone. Folks entrusted me with her care. Maybe you've seen her?" His eyes flicked toward Clara, narrowing. Luke's broad frame shifted subtly, placing himself between them. His voice, when it came, was low but firm. "And if I have?" Hale spread his hands, feigning gentleness. "Then you'd understand she needs guidance. She can't fend for herself. A mute girl's got no place trying to make her way without someone speaking for her. It's a charity I offer, not chains." Clara's pulse roared in her ears. His words dripped with the same control she had fled. She gripped Daisy's hand tighter, praying Luke could see through Hale's charm. Luke's gaze didn't waver. "She's not yours to claim." For the first time, Hale's smile cracked. "Careful, Boone. The law doesn't look kindly on harboring runaways. Papers can be drawn. Claims can be made." Luke stepped closer, his voice hardening. "You ought to leave while you still can." The yard fell silent but for the restless snort of horses in the corral. Hale's eyes burned with warning. He tugged his hat lower, swung back onto his horse, and reined it sharply. "I'll be back," he said, the easy tone gone now. "With the law, you can't keep her." Clara trembled as he rode away, dust rising in his wake. Her past had caught her faster than she feared. Luke turned to her, his expression carved with resolve. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daisy broke the tension, slipping between them and clutching Clara's skirt. "He can't take her, Papa. She belongs here." Luke looked at his daughter, then at Clara, and gave a single nod. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow. "Not while I'm here." That evening, the Boone house was wrapped in uneasy silence. Daisy had gone to bed early, worn out from the long day, but Clara remained in the parlor, staring into the flames dancing in the hearth. Shadows leapt across the walls, flickering like restless memories. Luke sat opposite her, arms resting on his knees, hat set aside. He hadn't spoken since Hale's visit, though his presence filled the room like a steady anchor. Clara felt the weight of his eyes, patient but unyielding, waiting for her to explain what the preacher wanted. Her fingers twisted in her lap. At last, she reached for the slate Daisy had left on the side table. With chalk trembling in her hand, she scrawled 2 words, "My past." She looked up at him, and his nod urged her on. Clara set the slate aside and pressed her palms together, drawing in a breath. Then she began, not with words but with her voice fragile, halting notes, a lullaby, one she had carried since childhood. The same song she had hummed to the chickens, to Daisy, to herself on lonely nights. Luke's eyes softened. though pain shadowed them. When the melody faded, Clara reached again for the slate. This time her writing was slower, deliberate. My mother taught me. She sang it when I was afraid. She said it would keep the dark away. The chalk snapped under the pressure of her grip. She swallowed hard, her silent voice straining to say what her hand had to. After she died, my father said music was weakness. He said silence was obedience. He wanted me bound by it. Her shoulders trembled, but she forced herself to keep writing. Hale took me in. He said I was his ward. He wanted me as his servant, his possession. I ran before he could make it worse. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. His silence was not disbelief but restraint, a man containing fire. Clara's hand shook as she wrote the final line. I'm not strong enough to go back. For a long moment, only the fire crackled between them. Then Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and spoke slowly, but each word heavy with conviction. Strength isn't about noise. You're stronger than anyone I've met, Clara. You faced the dark and ran toward the light. That took more courage than most men ever find. Her eyes burned, but she couldn't look away. His voice, rough and uneven, was the sound she hadn't known she needed. Luke's gaze drifted to the slate. And that song, it doesn't belong to Hale. Doesn't belong to your father. It belongs to you, just like it belonged to my wife. Maybe that's why it found its way here, to this place, to us. Clara pressed a hand over her heart, overwhelmed. The silence between them was no longer a barrier but a bond. She reached out, setting her fingers lightly over his calloused hand. For the first time in years, Luke didn't pull away. 2 days passed before the sound of hooves thundered down the Boone Road again. Dust curled in the noonday sun as Reverend Hale rode at the front of 3 mounted lawmen. Their badges glinted like cold steel. Clara froze where she stood by the garden, her hands tightening around the basket she held. Luke stepped out from the barn, calm but solid, his figure a wall between them and the house. Daisy, peering from the porch, clutched the railing but said nothing. Hale's smile returned, smooth as ever. Boone, he called, tipping his hat. I warned you I'd be back. The law's clear this girl is my ward. You've no right to keep her. Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to shrink behind Luke, but something inside her urged her forward. Not this time. Not again. The sheriff dismounted, unfolding a paper from his coat. We've got orders to return her to Hale's custody. Says here she's under his care by arrangement. Luke's voice carried, low but steady. Paper doesn't change the truth. She's not his to take. Hale's eyes gleamed with triumph. And who'll speak for her, Boone? She can't even defend herself. The words cut sharp, but Clara felt heat rise in her chest. Slowly, she set the basket aside and walked to Luke's side. His head turned sharply, concern etched on his face, but she met his gaze with quiet resolve. Clara's hands shook as she lifted them, forming signs she had long hidden. She pointed to herself, then drew a line across her chest, before turning to the sheriff. Not his, she mouthed. The lawman hesitated. Hale scoffed. That's not testimony, Sheriff. That's nonsense. She can't even... But Clara raised her hand. Her lips parted, her throat straining. For a moment, nothing came. Then, hoarse but clear, she forced the words out. I choose here. The sound was broken, rough, but it struck through the air sharper than any paper Hale waved. Daisy gasped, her eyes shining. Luke's chest tightened, pride swelling alongside awe. The sheriff looked between them, uncertainty shadowing his face. She spoke it plain, Reverend. Choice counts for something. Hale's composure faltered. You'd let a frightened girl decide her fate? Luke stepped closer, voice firm. She's not frightened anymore. The standoff stretched, tense as a drawn rope. Finally, the sheriff crumpled the paper in his fist. No crime here. If she wants to stay, she stays. Hale's face darkened, fury simmering beneath his mask. He swung onto his horse, glaring down at Clara. This isn't over. With a hard tug of the reins, he turned and thundered down the road, the lawmen trailing behind. Silence settled heavy on the yard. Clara's knees wavered, but Luke's hand was there steadying her. Daisy ran forward, wrapping her arms around Clara's waist. "She did it, Papa!" Daisy cried. "She spoke." Luke's eyes softened as he looked at Clara. "Yes," he said, his voice breaking into something almost like a smile. She found her voice. Weeks passed, and the ranch seemed to breathe easier. The tension that Hale's presence had left behind faded, replaced by laughter and the steady rhythm of life. Clara moved through the days with a confidence she hadn't known before, caring for the animals, tending the garden, cooking meals that filled the little house with warmth. But it was her voice, however fragile, that brought the greatest change. She couldn't speak long, not yet, but she tried. A few words at a time, whispered softly. Each one claimed a victory. Daisy cheered every syllable as if Clara had lifted mountains. And Luke, quiet Luke, listened to each attempt with patient pride. On a bright afternoon, Clara and Luke mended the front porch together. Daisy skipped between them, carrying nails and chattering about the town gathering set for that weekend. "You'll come, won't you, Clara? They'll want to hear you sing." Clara's cheeks flushed, but Daisy's wide eyes left her little choice. She nodded shyly. Luke, hammer poised, met her gaze. "Only if you want to," he said. The ease in his voice told her he'd never force her, but his eyes carried hope. The gathering came on a golden evening. Families filled the churchyard, tables spread with food, children chasing one another under lanterns. Music drifted from a fiddle, and Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, hands folded tightly. Her stomach fluttered, but Daisy tugged her forward, right to the small platform where neighbors urged for a song. Luke was already there, standing beside her, his presence steady as a mountain. The crowd hushed. Clara closed her eyes. For a heartbeat, fear clutched her. Then she felt Daisy's little hand in hers, and Luke's voice low at her side. "You're not alone," she began softly, the familiar lullaby spilling into the night. Her voice wavered but did not break. The notes carried into the air, wrapping the crowd in stillness. Faces softened, eyes glistened. And then, to everyone's surprise, Luke joined her. His voice was deep, worn with years of silence, but strong. The harmony filled the night, not as farewell to his wife, but as a beginning with Clara. Together, their voices rose, one mended, one discovered, blending into something whole. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted in applause. Daisy clapped loudest of all, bouncing on her toes. Clara's chest trembled, not with fear but with joy. She looked at Luke, whose faint smile was more than she had ever dreamed to see. The Boone Ranch no longer stood as a house of grief. It was alive with flowers by the porch, laughter in the halls, and music that had returned to its rooms. Clara had found not only her voice but a place where it belonged, and Luke Boone, once bound by silence, had found the courage to speak and to love again. If you thought a silent bride finding her voice was powerful, just wait until you hear the next story, where love speaks louder than any words.